There's plenty of weirdness in the Winston Churchill story. This is a man with a borderline obsession with war and conflict, and with a propensity for showing off his naked body to just about anyone who'll look. This is also a man who drank from dawn till dusk and had some rather, shall we say, contradictory ideas about race. But the thing about discussing Churchill is this: there are plenty of weird facts about the man, and there are plenty of weird myths about him too. Just take one of his most famous quotes as an example. The following Churchill maxim has graced 1,000,001 motivation Instagram accounts and grindset slop TikTok channels. You have enemies? Good. That means you've stood up for something sometime in your life. Great, snappy, directly to the point. The only problem is, he didn't say it. The closest thing we've got to that is this real quote made by Churchill in the House of Commons in 1952. The spectacle of a number of middle-aged gentlemen who are my political opponents being in a state of uproar and fury is really quite exhilarating to me. It's still pretty good, but it's not going to get anyone to sign up for that dodgy crypto trading course. Another famous quote is this one about life in the Navy. Don't talk to me about naval tradition. It's nothing but rum, buggery, and the lash. This is another hand-me-down story with no reliable origin, and reportedly, when Churchill was asked about it, he said, "I never said it. I wish I had." But even that quote isn't verified. So separating the fact from the myth is not always easy, to say the least, and if we're looking at the weirder side of Churchill, we've got to be pretty careful with what's real and what ain't. That being said, we are going to go into some pretty heavy subject matter with this one, from constant mental health issues to death and destruction on the battlefield. So, as we delve into the weirdness at the heart of Churchill's character, we are going to do our best to get it right, even if that's sometimes a bit grim. Right from the very beginning of this story, mythology and reality are entwined. So, let's try to unpick them. There's a popular tale that Churchill was born in a cloakroom as his mother unexpectedly went into labour while taking part in a dance. This is true, it's a fact, but it's also quite exaggerated. The New York-born heiress Jeanette Jerome was indeed taking part in a dance on November 30th, 1874, but by this point she was Lady Randolph Churchill, and she wasn't attending events at the local community hall or leisure centre. Instead, this dance was held in the much grander environment of Blenheim Palace, where the Churchill family was living at the time. And young Winston really did come into this world in a room filled with discarded hats, coats, cloaks, and feather boas. But it was just a temporary cloakroom. It was in fact a spare bedroom at the palace, which was being used as a cloakroom for the evening. So yes, the myth is true, but it's certainly been exaggerated in the telling. Churchill apparently became quite attached to his boyhood home of Blenheim Palace, and later held his wedding there. He would even go on to say, "At Blenheim I took two very important decisions, to be born and to marry. I am content with the decision I took on both occasions." It was during his childhood at Blenheim that Churchill's path in life was first laid out for him, but again, not necessarily in the way that accepted history often suggests. There's an idea that the young Churchill was a rambunctious, irrepressible leader of men. The historian James Muller tells a story of how Churchill and his chums would push other boys into the swimming pond at Harrow School. When they had a chance, they would sneak up on the other boys and, grabbing their towels out of generosity, would shove them into the water from behind. Muller says Churchill did this to a boy named Leo Amory, who grew up to be a cabinet minister and a long-term political opponent of Churchill. Churchill's adolescent hijinks did come back to bite him in adulthood. But such public school japes are only part of the full story, and in fact, rather than doling out punishments to his fellow schoolboys, often it was Churchill who was the one getting bullied. In the words of author Matt Elton, at school, he was conscious of being small and runty. Other kids threw cricket balls at him, and he ran away. He later said that, having been in many ways a coward, there was nothing that he wanted more than to acquire a reputation for physical bravery. This desire to be seen as brave, and to be perceived as a man who does not shy away from danger, would develop into an obsession that would never truly leave Churchill. Meanwhile, young Winston wasn't doing particularly well at school. As James Muller points out, he wasn't exactly a dunce, but he wasn't a glowing student either. No one considered him a prime minister in the making. While attending Harrow School, his academic performance was pretty poor. He tended to be towards the bottom of any class that he was in, and punishments from his teachers were a regular occurrence. He'd also begun developing the habits that were going to shape his image, like chomping on one of those ubiquitous cigars. Apparently, Churchill's cigar habit was already a problem by the time that he was only 15 years old. A letter from Lady Randolph Churchill more or less proves this. If you knew how foolish and how silly you look smoking cigars, you would give it up, at least for a few years. Lady Randolph eventually took to bribery to try and get her son to kick the habit. If he could refrain from cigars for 6 months, she told him, he'd receive a gun and a pony in return. He took up his mum's challenge and succeeded. When he got his new toys, he then promptly went back to smoking cigars, presumably on the back of a pony, gun in hand. The fact that he was offered a gun as a reward tells us something about the young Churchill, which was that he certainly enjoyed the military side of things. For Churchill's father, Lord Randolph, it wasn't the cigar smoking that was a problem, it was basically everything else. His lordship doesn't exactly come across as the nicest of blokes, even at the best of times, but the treatment of his son makes him look like a stereotypical Victorian toff from a Thackeray novel. After years of exasperation with his son's poor performance at school, Lord Randolph decided to send Winston to the Sandhurst Military Academy. Winston himself was probably very happy about this. But that word academy would come back to haunt young Winston. His old academic failings reared their ugly head again, and of course, he failed the entrance exam, and then he failed it again. You can almost imagine Lord Randolph's apoplectic rage at this. But lucky for Winston, he tried a third time, and this time, he was accepted. So, now that Winston was definitely going to Sandhurst, the relationship between the impetuous son and the frosty father could finally be healed. It would all be happily ever after for the pair. Except no, of course not. Lord Randolph wanted his son to join the 60th Rifles just like he himself had. Sandhurst was in fact a last resort. Bear with me while I relate some of the highlights of the long letter that Lord Randolph sent his son after hearing the news of his acceptance at Sandhurst. It goes on a bit, but trust me, it's worth it. You should be ashamed of your slovenly, happy-go-lucky, harum-scarum style of work. Never have I received a really good report of your conduct from any headmaster or tutor. Always behind. Incessant complaints of a total want of application to your work. Do not think that I am going to take the trouble of writing you long letters after every failure you commit and undergo. I no longer attach the slightest weight to anything you may say. If you cannot prevent yourself from leading the idle, useless, unprofitable life you've had during your school days, you will become a mere social wastrel. One of hundreds of public school failures, and you will degenerate into a shabby, unhappy, and futile existence. And finally, here's the icing on the cake. You will have to bear all the blame for such misfortunes. Your mother sends her love. So, as Churchill's childhood reaches its conclusion, we're already seeing the roots beginning to sprout. We've seen a fractious, unpleasant relationship with his father. We've seen a childhood spent in fear and distraction. Both of these things would drive his obsession with being a man of action, a man who does not back down, even when backing down might be the better option. In adulthood, these roots will blossom into some of Churchill's stranger habits and idiosyncrasies. By 1895, Churchill was a soldier. He got to wear the fancy uniform of the 4th Queen's Own Hussars and do fun things like engage in training exercises and march about on parade. But deep down, this wasn't exactly what he had in mind when he went to Sandhurst. He was based in Aldershot, for starters, which is about as far as it's possible to get from the action of any sort. So joining the army did not scratch any sort of itch. That almost pathological desire to be in the thick of it just wasn't going away. Fortunately for Churchill, though, and unfortunately for the 400,000 people who would lose their lives, the Cuban War of Independence was just kicking off. Churchill jumped at this chance. He used his mother's connections to land himself a gig as a military observer and a war correspondent covering the conflict. As his biographer, the MP Roy Jenkins, wrote, Churchill assumed an almost divine right to be present at every scene of military action in the world, and pulled both his own and his mother's strings to get to them. And it seems that Churchill enjoyed himself immensely with the bullets and bombs flying back and forwards. As Jenkins said, Churchill celebrated his 21st birthday under mild fire. This he regarded as a very satisfactory concatenation. Roy Jenkins might be the kind of fellow who drops words like concatenation into daily conversation, but if you're like me, and you don't tend to do that, then it means a series of interconnected things or events. Churchill was really only there to observe, but he wanted to do a bit more than this, so he attached himself to the Spanish troops and very nearly found himself taking up arms. But, in any case, once Churchill finally returned from Cuba, the 4th Hussars were on the move. And so, the young Churchill spent time in India with his regiment. It seems he took to colonial life rather well, but he was itching for a bit more action. The 4th Hussars remained in India for nearly 9 years, but Churchill was not going to spend that much time on the sidelines. He remained in India for just 18 months. During this time, he managed to get himself involved in an expedition to the northwest frontier. He was working as a war correspondent once again, this time in the Swat Valley in Afghanistan. Just like in Cuba, he was there to observe and record, but there was certainly a part of Churchill who wanted to be more involved in the fighting. He seemed to genuinely hate the Pashtun tribesmen that he encountered in the Swat Valley. In 1897, he noted in his diary, "The tribesmen are among the most miserable and brutal creatures on earth. I find it impossible to come to any other conclusion than this. When these valleys are purged from the pernicious vermin that infest them, so will the happiness of humanity be increased, and the progress of mankind accelerated." He also seems to have enjoyed the action that unfolded around him, just like he had done in Cuba, he would later note. "People who enjoy war, it was fortunate that there were still savages and barbarous peoples. There were Zulus and Afghans, also the dervishes of Sudan. Some of them might, if they were well disposed, put up a show someday." But it wasn't just a love of war that fired Churchill's passions. There was also a definite racial tinge to his excitement too. In his writings, he repeatedly describes the British as the dominant race and everyone else as savages, and he outlines in cold detail the scorched earth policies of the British troops in the region. Now, hearing Churchill talk like this is either highly surprising or just what you'd expect, depending on your view of the man. In truth, Churchill's views were complex. He certainly could be a humanitarian. In 1899, he left the British Army's Sudan campaign in protest over General Herbert Kitchener's actions. Kitchener treated the enemy's wounded with ruthless brutality and desecrated the tomb of the Sudanese religious and political leader Mohammed Ahmad. Churchill felt that this was simply not on, and so he left his regiment shortly after taking part in the cavalry charge at the Battle of Omdurman. But if you've seen some of my other videos, particularly the one on the partition of India, you'll know that Churchill did harbour plenty of unpleasant views about Britain's imperial subjects. On Indian people, Churchill famously said in 1943, "I hate Indians. They are beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits." So yes, regardless of your view on Churchill, don't be surprised when he comes out with something like this. He was, to lean heavily on a cliché, a man of unusual contradictions. These contradictions are also evident in his apparent love of conflict. Sometimes it seems the barbarity of war became a little too much, even for Churchill. "It was not apparently all a gay adventure," he wrote after witnessing casualties in the aftermath of a battle. British casualties, of course. His taste of action in Cuba, Afghanistan and Sudan percolated into a lifelong obsession with all things martial and military, and Churchill basically tried to keep himself as close to the front line as possible until he was too old to do so anymore, and even for a little while after this point. Churchill's political career was also closely entwined with the armed forces. He ran as the Conservative candidate in Oldham in 1899, but after losing the by-election, he returned to journalism. This gave him a front row seat for the unfolding situation in South Africa, and as tensions rose between the British and the Boers, he decided to get ahead of the curve. He went straight to the heart of the action yet again, but then a Boer artillery shell hit the train he was travelling in, and Churchill was captured. He complained that he'd been a non-combatant, and so didn't belong in a POW camp. The Boer response was, "You were carrying a revolver, so you were fair game." Churchill's subsequent escape from the POW camp is another chapter of his life that's passed into legend, and in this case, it seems to be largely true. He really did scale the wall of his camp in a bid for freedom, he really did hop freight trains to get away from his pursuers, and he really did hide in a coal mine to evade recapture. It seems Churchill might have been a little eccentric and even a little foolhardy, but he was also a boy's own style adventurer, and that certainly adds something to his appeal. He will be back in South Africa in 1900, and this time he was very much a combatant. He fought at Ladysmith and at Pretoria, and it seems he finally got the chance to show the British Army what he could do. But politics was calling him again, and the next few years saw him rising through the ranks of the Conservative Party ranks before crossing the floor and rising through the Liberal ranks instead. By 1910, he was Home Secretary, and surely his army days were now behind him. But that martial desire never fully left Churchill. The idea that he was not at the heart of the action rankled with him, but the old adage, "Be careful what you wish for," springs to mind here, because fate was about to throw the world a curveball. When the First World War broke out in August of 1914, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. Now he was determined to have an active role in deciding the conflict. He was the key political architect behind an attack that would essentially knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and clear the way for an assault on Germany and Austria-Hungary via the back door. This was, of course, the Dardanelles Offensive and Gallipoli. Churchill's massive miscalculation has become infamous across the years, but there were some grains of wisdom in his audacious plan. If it had been successful, it would have been lauded as a masterstroke. But the sick men of Europe, as Churchill called the Ottomans, were ready for a fight, especially on their home soil. The crumbling empire fought doggedly and ferociously. While the Royal Navy struggled in the Straits, British and Imperial troops were cut down in their dozens on the devastatingly brutal terrain of southwestern Turkey. With too few troops to push inland and no hope of supply from the sea, thousands were left trapped on the beaches, with the might of the Turkish forces bearing down on them. Churchill was militarily humiliated, but it seems that the defeat hurt more than just his pride. Allied forces suffered up to 300,000 casualties across the campaign and perhaps 61,000 dead. Churchill took the loss of so many men in the Dardanelles personally. With trademark drama and gusto, he announced that he would make up for his failure by resigning as First Lord of the Admiralty and joining the brave boys on the front line. Churchill did ultimately go to the Western Front. He briefly served as Lieutenant Colonel and led the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers. While he didn't do any actual fighting, he did get shelled a lot. He was very nearly torn apart by a piece of shrapnel after ordnance exploded at a distance a little too close for comfort. But after a while, his superiors in government got tired of the idea of someone like Churchill dodging shells and bullets in the trenches, and he was back in politics by 1917 and became Minister of Munitions under Lloyd George. The long road to number 10 followed, but even landing the biggest job in the land couldn't completely dampen Churchill's own military ambitions. Later on in the Second World War, as the Allied forces prepared for an assault on the beaches of Normandy in the spring of 1944, Churchill was desperate to be among the forces going ashore. Needless to say, the idea of a British Prime Minister wading ashore under enemy machine gun fire didn't go too well, especially not a 69-year-old Prime Minister who was not exactly known for his great health. Eventually, the panic over Churchill's obsession went all the way to the top, and it was King George VI himself who finally vetoed the idea. And Churchill, much to his chagrin, never assaulted the Normandy beaches. Churchill might have felt duty-bound to be among the lads assaulting the Normandy beaches, but realistically, this was his own obsessions taking over. He'd have been more hindrance than help on D-Day. So, his escapades in Cuba and Afghanistan had ignited an obsessive military fire in Churchill, but they'd also given him something else too, which took him in some rather unexpected directions. Churchill is certainly known as a man of words as well as actions, and his unique orations have become part of his historical legacy. Speeches like "We shall fight them on the beaches," delivered in June 4th, 1940, and his "The Few" speech from August that year have become part of the bedrock of Britain's 20th century identity. It's quite surprising to learn that Churchill actually struggled with a speech impediment that he'd inherited from his father. Like his father, Churchill battled against a lateral lisp, which basically meant that he found it hard to pronounce S sounds. He hated this impediment when he was a youngster and would repeatedly practice phrases like "The Spanish ships I cannot see, for they are not in sight," in order to try and fix it. It seems to have done the trick, but weirdly it did the trick a bit too well. As a politician, he fell in love with the impediment that he'd previously hated. He seemed to think of it as something that gave him a unique, individual character. It was the foundation of a new obsession, which was to be different to his peers. In fact, he went so far as to have a special set of dentures crafted. These dentures would exaggerate his natural lisp when he spoke. Jane Hughes, of the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons, had this to say about the magical mandibles. "These really are the teeth that saved the world. Without them, fight them on the beaches would never have sounded the same." So the spoken word is certainly something Churchill is known for, but one of his real passions was in fact the written word. Churchill's journalism on subjects like the Boer War and the Siege of Malakand in British India are well known, but less well known, and perhaps better forgotten, is his novel. In 1898, Churchill published the serialised version of Savrola, which was released as a standalone book 2 years later. Written while Churchill was in India, the novel focuses on a fictional European country undergoing revolution and civil war. It's not the best book, truth be told, and when Churchill finally won his Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, it was for his speeches and factual writings, not for his fiction. In fact, Churchill himself seemed a little embarrassed by his foray into novel writing and would later say, "I have consistently urged my friends to abstain from reading it." It wasn't just writing that Churchill enjoyed as a hobby, he was also something of an artist, working under the pseudonym Charles Morin. Churchill was a pretty good painter, actually. He was no great master, but his brush and easel skills were certainly better than his novel writing skills. He was also far more prolific, producing hundreds of paintings and only one novel. Some of these paintings have commanded massive sums. In 2006, a 1951 painting named View of Tinghir sold at Sotheby's for a whopping £612,800. However, the buyer was probably more interested in Churchill the man rather than Churchill the artist. Sotheby's Sarah Thomas admitted that the paintings tended to be pretty poor and amateur and full of splodges. But there is a darker aspect to Churchill's artistic and literary endeavours. In an interview with the BBC, Thomas gently stated that Churchill turned to things like painting in order to find relief from all the pressures of his work. This is a pretty diplomatic conclusion. Churchill's own view of his art suggests that there was something else at play. Rather than just stress relief, he said, "Happy are the painters, for they shall not be lonely. Light and colour, peace and hope will keep them company to the end." Roy Jenkins was in no doubt that Churchill suffered greatly with depression for his entire adult life. He said his writing habit was his best protection against black dog. The black dog of depression was a constant lance at Churchill's side. This explains why he constantly needed distractions and things to take his mind off this debilitating condition. To achieve this, he threw himself into lots of other hobbies, not just writing and painting. This is despite the fact that he shouldn't have had that much time, considering he was one of the world's leading statesmen. It's not unusual, of course, for politicians to write history books and novels, or even paint pictures. But bricklaying has to be a less usual pastime on the Commons floor. That didn't deter Churchill, though. He loved building things with bricks, and Churchill's Chartwell estate is full of structures that the man made with his own two hands. He even joined the Amalgamated Union of Building Trade Workers, where he was a valued member, until he rejoined the Conservative Party in 1925. It seems having an ex-Tory minister among the ranks was just about acceptable for a trade union, but having a current member of the Conservative Party in their ranks was just a step too far. Churchill was promptly ejected from the union. Another big hobby of Churchill's was raising animals. Like with many people who have thrown themselves wholeheartedly into the blood and bluster of warfare, he kept a soft spot in his heart for the non-human members of the animal kingdom. The Chartwell estate basically turned into a cross between a zoo and a farm. The standard cats and dogs were scattered everywhere, including his poodles, bizarrely named Rufus I and Rufus II, but there were plenty of other animals too. Lions, leopards, swans, kangaroos, pigs, butterflies, you name it, Churchill kept it. And when Harrods had to close down their live fish department at the outbreak of war in 1939, Churchill gave them all a new home at Chartwell. Keeping fish is of course nothing unusual, but naming your fish is less expected. Apparently, Churchill would call some of the fish to him by name, according to the breeder and supplier Stanley Plater. When some of his fish disappeared in the run-up to D-Day in the spring of 1944, foul play was suspected, and Churchill called Scotland Yard, demanding a full investigation. It was believed that natural predators had taken the fish. The most obvious culprits were the otters, who frequent the nearby Kentish rivers. But Churchill wasn't having any of that. For him, gypsies were to blame. There was no basis for these accusations, and in the end no otter nor traveller was ever charged with the crime. Churchill's love of animals led to one of his most famous quotes: "Dogs look up to you. Cats look down on you. Give me a pig. He looks you in the eye and treats you as an equal." Except, like with many of Churchill's supposed utterances, we're not sure he ever actually said it. This version was relayed by Churchill's private secretary, Sir Anthony Montagu Brown, and it's not confirmed, but it is a nice quote. So sometimes it is fun to just print the legend. Some of Churchill's other most celebrated quotes arise from another habit we've not touched on yet, and that was his drinking. You could even call it another hobby rather than a habit. Churchill was very, very fond of drinking. When Bernard Montgomery told Churchill, "I neither drink nor smoke, and I am 100% fit," Churchill allegedly replied, "I drink and smoke, and I am 200% fit." When the MP, Bessie Braddock, told Churchill, "Winston, you are drunk, and what's more, you are disgustingly drunk," Churchill apparently responded with, "Bessie, my dear, you are ugly, and what's more, you are disgustingly ugly, and tomorrow I shall be sober, and you will still be disgustingly ugly." It's not exactly the most gallant comeback from Winston. His contemporaries report that Churchill was usually courteous and respectful to women, so maybe this interaction never happened. Of course, he may simply have been disgustingly drunk. Real or not, these quotes are yet more pieces of the endlessly complex puzzle that makes up the image of Churchill. But how much can we really read into them? I mean, with so much work to do, how much could Churchill really have been drinking? Well, according to the author Richard Langworth, he was drinking a hell of a lot. Langworth outlines Churchill's daily schedule like this: 7:30, wake up, remain in bed, eat breakfast, read newspapers, work, glass of whiskey and soda. 11, out of bed, stroll around garden supervising estate, whiskey and soda. 1 p.m, multi-course lunch, imperial pint of champagne. 3:30, work from study, glass of cognac. Hour and a half nap/siesta, a habit acquired during his time in Cuba. 6:30, wake up, bath, dress for dinner. 8, lengthy dinner with guests, imperial pint of champagne. Midnight, work in study, more cognac. 1 a.m. to 3 a.m, bedtime. Even if we factor in the different attitudes of the time, this is a lot of alcohol consumption. It also seems to be just a typical day, so we can only imagine what Churchill drank on special occasions. Churchill likely enjoyed drinking, and he was definitely high functioning. He certainly proved his father wrong about amounting to nothing. But a whiskey and soda in bed at 7:30 a.m, and it's not even Christmas. It's hard to link these habits to Churchill's difficult childhood, a mother who was often absent and aloof, a father who seemed to just plain hate him. And given what we know about Black Dog and the mental health struggles he faced his whole adult life, this level of drinking becomes all the more alarming. If we're going to be charitable, we might say he needed all that alcohol to serve as a sort of social lubricant. Remember, Churchill was almost obsessed with doing things differently and consumed with the idea of being different to the other statesmen of the world. And this influenced his mannerisms and personality. He was certainly known as being a bit of a character, to put it mildly. His nephew, John Spencer Churchill, remembered his uncle's extravagant impersonation of a gorilla. Few people can say they have seen the ex-First Lord of the Admiralty crouching in the branches of an oak, baring his teeth and pounding his chest. Among his friends and colleagues, though, Churchill was different. He wasn't quite so well known for doing impressions of great apes in adult company. For these people, he preferred a different sort of exhibitionism. Churchill seems to have had little shame or embarrassment when it came to his own nakedness. A famous story involves a meeting between Churchill and the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the winter of 1941 to 1942. This was a critical point in the war, as it came immediately after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and as Japan was tearing across the Pacific. The story goes that Roosevelt suddenly had an idea. He would call the new version of the League of Nations the United Nations. An idea this good simply could not wait, and so the president rushed into Churchill's guest room in the White House to tell him. In the words of Roosevelt's aide Harry Hopkins, there he found Churchill stark naked and gleaming pink from his bath. The PM then allegedly remarked, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." This sounds like another bit of apocryphal myth-making, but historians believe there is some truth in it. Richard Langworth says the story was confirmed both by Churchill's secretary, Patrick Kinner, and by his bodyguard, Walter Thompson. Kinner related this tale. He walked into his adjoining bedroom, followed by me, notebook in hand, and continued to dictate while pacing up and down. Eventually, the towel fell on the ground and President Roosevelt saw the British Prime Minister completely naked. Churchill himself was a bit cagey on the subject. He seemed a little abashed when questioned on the matter by Robert Sherwood, who was writing Roosevelt's biography at the time. Churchill told the author, "I could not possibly have made such a statement as that. The President himself would have been well aware that it was not strictly true." However, this was different from the account that he gave King George VI. Just after Churchill's return from Washington, the PM told the King, "Sir, I believe I am the only man in the world to have received the head of a nation naked." Receiving the head of a nation naked is one thing. Roosevelt probably wasn't over the moon, pardon the pun, to see Churchill standing there in all of his gleaming pink glory. But at least Roosevelt was in a powerful position. He probably handled the incident with little more than polite embarrassment. The problem is, Churchill received plenty of other people naked too. Churchill loved baths. He loved working in the bath, drinking in the bath, or working and drinking at the same time in the bath. He once said, "England and America are divided by a great ocean of salt water, but united by an eternal bathtub of soap and water." It's a nice sentiment, but this love of constant bathing caused a problem. Churchill didn't always work alone, and so his team would often need to be there while he was bathing too. The famous German cartoon of Churchill dictating a note in the bath while his red-faced stenographer stands in the doorway is not a piece of Nazi fantasy, it's what he actually used to do. This kind of behaviour just wouldn't fly nowadays, which is definitely a good thing. The idea of forcing a young college graduate to stand there and take notes while Keir Starmer or Donald Trump luxuriates in the tub is, well, best not to think about. But even back then, this was still pretty weird behaviour. If he was trying to mark himself out as unusual, then he certainly succeeded. 20 years later, US President Lyndon Johnson was known for holding meetings while he sat on the toilet, but he probably wasn't fully starkers at the time. There are several other stories about Churchill's nakedness and about anatomy in general. One involves an encounter with Clement Attlee at a urinal in the House of Commons. When the Labour Party leader stood next to Churchill, Churchill took a few steps away from him, and Attlee remarked, "Little standoffish today, are we, Winston?" Churchill apparently quipped back, "Every time you socialites see something big, you want to nationalise it." Churchill's private secretary, David Pitt-Blado, apparently confirmed this remark to be true. But Churchill wasn't always quite so proud about his own anatomy or about the British anatomy in general. One final lewd joke from Churchill comes from a British aid shipment to Russia. The Russians needed condoms, but Britain reportedly could only spare a single size, which was extra large. Perhaps in order to intimidate the communists he despised, Churchill ordered a change to the labelling on the boxes. The words extra large were removed, and in their place the label read, "Made in England, size medium." This story is almost certainly not true, but given what we know about Churchill's character, it's also not impossible. In any case, any video about Churchill is always going to be packed with famous quotes from the man. This video is already packed with them in my bestest impression, but to close us out, I've got one more for you. "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And Churchill was correct when he said this, but only to an extent. Churchill wrote history in more than one sense. As a journalist and author, he was directly responsible for much of the historiography of Britain's colonial outposts in the dying days of empire. And as a statesman during one of the most examined eras of human history, he had a hand in shaping the world to come. Even if you don't subscribe to the great men theory of history, it's difficult to argue against Churchill's influence in the middle of the 20th century. But our idea of what Churchill is, and what he represents, that was not authored by the man himself. Instead, our perception is filtered through decades worth of cultural influence and mythologizing. Churchill has become such a foundational part of Britishness, whatever that might mean, that it's sometimes easy to forget he was ever a real person at all. But he was real, a real person with very real flaws, insecurities and contradictions. The traumas and coldness he experienced in childhood never really left him. They coalesced into an obsession with being the brave man at the front, the leader, rather than the follower. This pushed him into some very dangerous situations which he somehow escaped, and as his power grew, it pushed others into dangerous situations too. Many of those did not escape. He was a figure who could stand up to the colonial atrocities of his peers, but still harbour some pretty racist views about the people who fell under the imperial yoke. He could be a devoted family man and a workaholic, but still drink from dawn to dusk, and subject poor secretaries to sights that no one other than his wife should really see. Churchill was a lot of things, and like I said right from the start, separating myth from reality is pretty difficult when it comes to Churchill. But he was, at heart, a human being, and by many accounts, quite a strange human being at that.